Okay, Jenny. Go stand on the corner. Everyone else, line up.
Maisie, Noah, and Levi stood shoulder to shoulder as Jenny took up position on the other side of the street under the broken street lamp. In the yellow glow, Jenny's long reddish hair burned like a bonfire. She lowered her chin until a shadow formed on her brow, casting her best evil monster grin into darkness.
Okay, I'm ready,
called Jenny. Maisie clasped hands with the boys. The three of them watched the cracked bulb carefully, waiting for the cone of light to dissipate. The light flickered, but stayed on. Jenny lurched to the side, ready to run, but quickly composed herself and returned to her waiting stance. Head down, hands hanging by her sides. "If you go early, you you lose," said Levi. "I know," said Jenny, without raising her head. Noah shuffled his feet, rubber soles scraping on concrete. A biker flew down the street, motor buzzing, lights off. Maisie didn't get a good look at the rider, but their face was cracked and ashen, like they were made of stone. Who knew why they were driving around Wallingford at night? The street lamp flickered again, and this time it stayed off. Jenny shrieked with delight. The game was afoot. Dragger stalks the night," sang Maisie, keeping her voice low. She gestured wildly at Noah and Levi. The boys lagged behind by a beat or two, but they joined in.
Dragger, quite a fright. Dragger hunts you down, drags you 6 feet underground.
The last line echoed over the rooftops, and then all was quiet again. Maisie and the boys crouched down, listening for any sign of the dragger. Shadows around them were long and deep. There was no telling if any one shifting shape was Jenny, a rat, or simply a trick of the moonlight. "Split up," whispered Maisie. "Noah, go left. Levi, go right. Don't get caught." "We always split up," mumbled Noah. "Splitting up is dumb. If we stayed together, she'd never get us." "Yeah, but that's boring," said Levi. He drummed some unknown rhythm on his wrist cast and wandered off into the darkness, following Maisie's instruction. Noah gave Maisie a plaintive look, but she just raised her eyebrows and pointed. "Left," she said again. After a moment's additional hesitation, Noah complied. Just like that, Maisie was alone in the dark, with only the distant din of the city and the occasional pair of headlights rolling down a nearby street to remind her that the world hadn't totally frozen. Maisie crept along the sidewalk, trailing her right hand along the brick buildings to cut off one angle of attack. Her night vision adjusted, bringing distant streaks of light into sharp relief. Still no sign of Jenny, but Maisie was confident. This time, she'd nab the dragger first. The dog, barking from a block or two away, startled her, and she tripped over the next crack in the sidewalk. Maisie fell, scraping her hand on the concrete. She had to suck in a breath to avoid giving herself away. The pain wasn't too bad, but her mom would chew her out for roughhousing, no doubt. Maisie spat on her palms and pushed on, determined to win this round. Slowly, Maisie leaned around the next corner, poking her head into the murky alleyway like a cartoon character. Light from an upper window painted slim prison bars of shadow over the pile of trash bags and overflowing dumpsters, leaving most of the alley in darkness. At the other side, just before the alley emerged onto the street, Maisie spotted the imprint of a slightly darker shadow. This was it. Jenny hadn't noticed her. Maisie slunk through the alley with steps precise enough for a tightrope. avoiding crumpled tin cans and discarded plastic bags like any one of them could spring to life and chomp her foot off. The shadow seemed to be getting somewhat taller as she got closer. Had Jenny climbed on top of a crate or something? He was only a few feet away now. The Dragger always won the Dragger watch, but Maisie was about to break their streak. No longer even daring to breathe, she reached out a hand to grab Jenny by the arm and claim her victory. Noah's telltale shriek echoed over the rooftops. He'd been caught.
Gotcha! Ha! And I'll drag you all the way back to my lair and eat you whole.
But that sounded like Jenny. So who was... Just before Maisie touched the figure in front of her, the shadow unfolded and turned towards her. Something hit the ground with a heavy, wet thump. Maisie couldn't suppress a gasp as she stumbled backwards, losing her balance and falling just inside the pool of light that spilled out from that second-floor window. The figure came closer, shadows stretching upward like a sprawling tree. Maisie pushed herself backwards, hand stinging, chest heaving with panic.
Did I startle you, girl?
I'm sorry, said a warm and welcoming voice. It reminded Maisie of one of her teachers at school, Mrs. Benson. She stopped trying to get away, squinting to try and make out the voice's origin. As the figure stepped into the light, Maisie relaxed. Before her was a tall woman with dark skin and perfectly coiffed hair, wearing a thick fur-collared jacket. Her eyes almost seemed to glow gold in the half-light. Maisie didn't know who the woman was, but she was way too pretty to be the Dragger.
Let me help you up,
said the woman, leaning down. She wrapped a slender hand around Maisie's wrist and gently pulled her to her feet. The woman even brushed the dust off the back of her shirt.
Thank you,
said Maisie, too relieved that she wasn't Dragger food to be wary of such a nice stranger.
Are your parents nearby?
Asked the woman, tilting her head. Maisie gestured back towards the street.
We live right over the hill. I'm just playing with some friends.
You shouldn't play in the streets after dark, said the woman. All kinds of dangerous things come out when the sun goes down. Maisie kicked a wad of crumpled paper.
I know, but you can't play Dragger Watch in the daytime,
she mumbled.
Did you say the Dragger?
The woman repeated.
That horrible urban legend. He's real,
said Maisie, shaking her head.
Levi says Marcus says Tisha says she saw him in the street one night, dragging another kid home to eat.
The woman smiled, baring a set of gleaming white teeth.
All the more reason to stay off the streets, then,
she said.
Go on, get your friends and run along home now.
Maisie wasn't certain, but had the woman blinked even once during their conversation? As she stared into the golden eyes, her own eyelids began to feel heavy. He hadn't been sleepy a moment ago, but it was probably a good idea to do as the woman said. Without another word, Maisie turned and jogged back the way she came, making for where she'd heard her friends' voices earlier. The woman's perfect smile didn't fade as she returned to the dazed broker she'd left slumped against a dumpster. She crouched in front of him, affecting a sympathetic expression.
Sorry to cut this short.
Why don't I call you a car? She said, contemplating his delectable pallid complexion made her yearn to dive back in and drink the rest. But it wouldn't do to make a mess. Zafir squeezed his face with one hand, examining his vacant eyes, his strong cheekbones. The gentleman might even make for a fine ghoul, if she happened to come across him on a future night. She spent a few moments memorizing his face, his build, the particular shade of his hair. Sophia used her praise phone to call a rideshare, then lifted him up with one arm around her shoulders. She brought him out of the alley and propped him up against a shuttered storefront, making sure he had enough of his wits about him to stay upright before letting go. "You know you are fortunate to have run into me, and not some other curiosity of the night," she said quietly, knowing he wouldn't remember any of this by dawn. "You could have been snatched up by a wolf. Or that awful dragger, if such a thing exists. Can you imagine?" The woman shook her head. "That little girl, too. I do hope she finds her way home safely." The man, still reeling and dizzy from ecstasy and blood loss, did not respond. Sophia smiled and patted his cheek. "You are an excellent listener. Your girlfriend is a lucky woman." The smile grew uncharacteristically wide. "And you are a lucky man." With that, Sophia turned on her heel and strode northward up the street, making for her haven. She ran her tongue along the back of her teeth, savouring the final few drops of her meal. Drag a watch. Children shouldn't play such silly games, she thought to herself. Not when there are real monsters stalking the streets. The herald vanished into the night, leaving behind a bewildered broker, a gaggle of nervous children, and the faint sound of flesh scraping against pavement.